Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. They said my old barn was an eyesore, so the HOA crossed my fence, forged permits, and sent a bulldozer to erase a century of legacy. Big mistake. Now the wreckage is evidence, and the woman behind it, facing prison. This isn't just a barn, it's a war, and I'm not backing down. I never thought I'd be defending a 130-year-old barn from a group of suburban lawn chair tyrants, but here I was, boots in the dirt, hands still stained with engine grease, watching a white Range Rover creep past the edge of my property like a vulture circling roadkill. Red Ridge Farm wasn't much to look at if you were the kind of person who measured life in granite countertops and heated driveways, but to me, it was everything. My land, my roots, my redemption after 20 years of war zones and bureaucracy. The barn had stood since 1896. My great-grandfather built it out of thick Colorado pine. It survived floods, a lightning strike in '43, and that time my uncle tried to turn it into a moonshine distillery. I spent the first 6 months after leaving the Army rebuilding that place with my own hands. New foundation, reinforced beams, weatherproofing, custom storage for tools and equipment, even an archival corner for our family records. It was part workshop, part museum, and entirely mine, so when that letter arrived in a glossy envelope with Aspen Hollow Estates HOA printed in pretentious cursive, I nearly used it to wipe the oil dipstick. Inside was a message dressed up as polite concern, but it boiled down to this: "Your barn is ugly. Tear it down." I laughed, out loud, alone, then read it again to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. According to them, my barn, located well outside their suburban fiefdom, was an aesthetic blight visible from the community perimeter and undermined the uniform architectural style of the neighborhood. They requested that I voluntarily demolish or visually screen the building to maintain the area's property values. I wrote a response. It was short, direct, and possibly typed while I was still covered in goat manure. I reminded them politely that Red Ridge Farm sat on land held in an inheritance trust, registered with Garfield County since before HOA bylaws were a glint in a Karen's eye. I attached a copy of the land deed, 3 survey maps, and a note from the county registrar confirming the property lay entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. Didn't matter. A week later, the queen bee herself showed up. I was tightening a tiller blade behind the barn when I heard the tires on gravel. I wiped my hands, came around front, and saw her, tall, manicured, wrapped in a cashmere sweater and superiority. She didn't introduce herself, just marched up like she'd been personally appointed by God to measure the worth of my fence lines. "I'm Karen Spencer," she said, president of the Aspen Hollow Homeowners Association. Of course you are, I thought. She didn't waste time. "This structure doesn't meet our community's visibility guidelines. It's unpainted, weathered. It's a barn," I cut in. "They tend to look like they've been outside for more than 5 minutes. She ignored that. "We've had complaints. Several homeowners can see it from their patios. It disrupts the overall harmony of the vista." I stared at her, genuinely impressed by the phrase, "harmony of the vista." "Lady, this barn's older than your entire subdivision." "That may be," she said with a smile made of glass, "but Aspen Hollow Estates prides itself on aesthetic cohesion. We'd appreciate your cooperation." I gave her my best deadpan. "You're about 200 yards and 1 jurisdiction over the line, Ms. Spencer. I'm not in your HOA. This land's been independent since 1890. We have a registered historic structure designation with the state. You have no authority here." She blinked. Once. Slowly. "Perhaps we could find a compromise." "Nope." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't take a step forward. I just said it like I was telling her the sky was blue and the barn wasn't moving an inch. She stared at me another moment, then gave a tight nod and turned back to her Range Rover without another word. But I saw the look in her eyes as she left, like a cat who couldn't catch the bird but still planned to knock over the cage. The second letter came 2 days after Karen's visit. It was thicker, this time bearing the Aspen Hollow HOA logo embossed in gold. Inside were official documents, a multi-page proposal for community harmony, several grainy photographs of my barn taken without permission, and a list of recommended architectural adjustments that included options like painting the structure beige, installing false dormers, or, my personal favorite, replacing the outdated structure with a contemporary greenhouse. I laughed again. Not the same laugh as before. This one was lower, sharper. I called Kara Olson, a lawyer I'd worked with during a zoning issue years ago. She'd once sued a luxury development for trying to reroute a creek and buried them in environmental code violations until they cried uncle. Kara read the HOA proposal in silence. Then she chuckled. "You're not in their jurisdiction. This is unenforceable nonsense." But they're escalating. That's a problem. I started to notice more cars driving slowly past the edge of my land, phones pointed at my barn. One SUV even pulled halfway into my drive, reversed, then took off when I stepped onto the porch. A local reporter I knew from the county fair called to ask about a community controversy involving my property. Turns out HOA had been feeding the press a narrative. Longtime structure threatens elite neighborhood's visual integrity. Then came the buyout offer. A guy named Stuart Lance, real estate broker and Aspen Hollow resident, showed up one morning in an overpriced pickup. He had slicked back hair, a cologne fog, and a file folder full of lies. "Caleb Wright, big fan of what you've done with the place. Historic, rustic, love it." He said it like I was a tourist attraction. Then he slid the folder across my kitchen table. "We've got a developer looking to expand. Wants to build a wellness center, maybe a vineyard, upscale stuff. Great for the community. They'd need the barn lot, of course, but they're offering top dollar." I flipped through the proposal. They'd already drawn up plans. My barn wasn't just gone. It was replaced by a spa and a koi pond. I closed the folder. Not for sale. Stuart gave me that real estate grin. "You sure? These folks are very motivated. Zoning's a hiccup, sure, but with the HOA on board, we can not for sale." He left. Less cheerful. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of bourbon, staring at the outline of the barn under the moonlight. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was proof that my family had stood their ground here for generations, that we didn't sell out, didn't bend. A week later, a new article hit the local Gazette. Local farmer defies HOA, declines to contribute to community standards. The picture showed my barn from a distance, zoomed in just enough to make it look like a collapsing shack. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. I printed a response and stapled it to the post at the end of my drive. Red Ridge Farm is not, and will never be, under the jurisdiction of Aspen Hollow HOA. This land is private, sovereign, and historically protected. Stay off it. That afternoon, I found 2 of my security cameras knocked sideways. One was unplugged, the other had a cracked lens. I fixed both and installed 2 more, higher up, less accessible. Karen wasn't coming at me with legal force. She was playing politics, trying to surround me, isolate me, frame me as the problem. But I've been surrounded before. I've fought my way out before. I don't back down. I sharpened my tools that night, checked my camera feeds, and slept with my boots by the door. It was a Wednesday. I remember that because I was halfway to Glenwood Springs picking up a replacement carburetor when I got the call from Liz, my neighbor 2 lots down. Liz doesn't usually call unless it's about weather or bears, so when I saw her name, I picked up immediately. "Caleb," she said, breathless, "there's a bulldozer on your property." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. What? A dozer. One of those big yellow bastards. Came in from the Aspen Hollow Road entrance. There's a bunch of people with HOA badges standing around watching. "They're knocking down your barn." The signal cut out briefly, but not before I heard her say, "They've already taken down 1 wall." I don't remember turning the truck around. I just remember flying back over gravel and potholes, gripping the wheel hard enough my knuckles went white. The drive took 43 minutes. When I got there, it felt like stepping into a war zone. The barn was gone, not partially damaged. Not under construction, leveled, crumpled boards, bent metal, busted tool chests. My grandfather's seed press lay shattered like it had been stepped on. My diesel mixer was cracked in half, fluid oozing like blood. And then I saw Samson. My mare had been tied up behind the barn before I left. A gentle, retired draft horse I rescued from slaughter. He was limping in circles, one leg visibly swollen. His tether had snapped during the destruction, and he dragged himself across the yard to the fence line. I dropped to my knees beside him. He nudged my chest, trembling. I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, I saw one of the HOA clowns, a guy I'd seen once at a barbecue bragging about his Tesla's paint job. He handed me a laminated note. "In compliance with HOA visibility standards. Thank you for your cooperation," it read, in cheery block print. I looked at him. "You touch my land again, and I swear I'll—" "Sir, I'm just following the association's directive." He backed off, hands up, like I was the problem. I carried Samson's weight the best I could into the stable and called Dr. Miller, the vet. Then I called the sheriff's department. Deputy McLean showed up within the hour, took one look at the wreckage, and muttered, "Jesus Christ." We walked the perimeter. I showed him tire tracks, fresh from the road that cut in through the back of Aspen Hollow, over the boundary fence they'd flattened. My cameras caught the whole thing. Time-stamped footage of the dozer arriving, 2 HOA members waving it forward, and 15 minutes of systematic destruction. When I handed McLean the footage, he whistled. "This isn't a civil matter anymore." "What do you mean?" He gave me a look. "They crossed into private land, used heavy equipment without consent, caused physical damage, and hurt an animal in the process. That's criminal trespass and malicious mischief. If you push it, maybe even aggravated cruelty." The moment I heard criminal, something in my gut shifted. I called Kara, sent her the footage, then went silent for about 10 seconds. "They came onto your property with a bulldozer?" she said, finally incredulous. "Yep." "And left a note like they did you a favor?" "Yep." I heard her exhale through her teeth. "I'll file for an emergency injunction and criminal complaint." This just went from annoying to felony-level stupid. The vet arrived. Samson had a fractured cannon bone. Could have been worse, but he'd need months of rehab and might never walk normally. I nodded as she explained it, then handed her my credit card. Later that night, I stood where the barn used to be, holding a busted iron hinge in my hand. That barn had weathered 3 generations of Colorado storms, wildfires, and financial crashes. It took one HOA president and a bulldozer 15 minutes to erase it, but you don't wipe out legacy with diesel fuel and bad taste. I took that hinge and nailed it to the new gatepost. A reminder, a promise. This wasn't over. By the next morning, I had a case file the size of a phone book. Kara worked fast. She'd already drafted a formal criminal complaint, collected my deed and title history, and prepped a timeline of the events, from the first HOA letter to the bulldozer's tracks still fresh in my field. She also flagged something that made her pause mid-sentence during our call. "Caleb," she said, "they submitted a permit to justify the demolition, signed by a supposed inspector from the Garfield County Building Department." Supposed. Because I just got off the phone with that department. They don't have anyone by that name. Never issued any permit to Aspen Hollow HOA. "That document is fake." Silence stretched between us. Kara continued, her voice harder now. "We're not just talking trespassing. If they forged government documents, they're stepping into serious felony territory. I printed every camera still, loaded every video file to a thumb drive, and drove to the sheriff's office." Deputy McLean had already filed the preliminary report, but with Kara's documents in hand, he elevated it. Fast. Within the hour, we were sitting with Sheriff Bowers himself. "Barn's gone," I told him. "My property line's been violated. My horse's leg is busted, and now it turns out they used forged county documents to justify the whole thing." Bowers rubbed his temple, then leaned forward. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" "Yes," I said. "Every damn one they qualify for." That same afternoon, HOA was served with a cease and desist order and notified of the criminal investigation. Kara filed an emergency injunction, freezing any further interventions on my land. Then things got interesting. A man in a navy suit showed up at my gate. Tall, thin, prematurely white hair. The HOA's lawyer, I assumed. He introduced himself as David Lerner, representing Aspen Hollow Estates. "We'd like to resolve this amicably," he said. Surely this was a misunderstanding, perhaps a mistake by the contractor. I looked at him dead in the eye. "You think contractors show up with bulldozers and tear down buildings by accident?" He smiled tightly. "I think there may be ways to avoid further escalation, perhaps a settlement. If we dropped our claim about the non-compliant structure and you waived legal proceedings." "You're talking bribes. I'm talking solutions. You bulldozed a barn. You maimed my horse. You forged a county document." His smile evaporated. "These kinds of cases are expensive. HOA is prepared to argue that you're exploiting the situation to extract money." "Oh, we're past money. This is about law now. And you broke it." He left with that lawyer look. Tight lips, full briefcase, and a twitch in the temple. Later that week, we got a break. One of the construction workers who'd operated the dozer came forward, anonymously at first. His conscience got the better of him. Karen Bowers arranged a formal deposition under immunity. Under oath, the man testified that Karen Spencer, not the HOA board but Karen personally, had hired him directly. She claimed it was an emergency cleanup, showed him a fake permit, and told him verbatim, "Don't worry about the owner. He's just squatting on legacy land. We're reclaiming it." Kara nearly exploded when she read the transcript. That's conspiracy. She used false documents to mislead a contractor into committing a crime, and she did it knowingly. We filed an updated complaint: criminal conspiracy, document forgery, malicious destruction of property, animal endangerment. Meanwhile, I called the local news myself. They came out with a crew, interviewed me next to the wreckage. I didn't play for sympathy. I spoke directly. This isn't about a barn. It's about power. They think they can push people off land they've held for generations. They're wrong. 2 days later, Kara got a call from a state-level prosecutor. Word had spread. This wasn't just an HOA squabble anymore. I woke up to a headline: Farmer or Menace. HOA claims dangerous structure justified emergency demolition. There was a photo of me, taken from a bad angle, where I looked like I'd just emerged from a root cellar with a grudge. The article quoted concerned residents from Aspen Hollow, calling my barn a collapsing hazard, alleging it had attracted wildlife, and even hinted at illegal storage of unknown machinery. One neighbor claimed they heard strange mechanical noises at night. Another said they were afraid for their children. I laughed so hard I almost spilled coffee on the printed copy. Then I read the last line. HOA is pursuing a counter-lawsuit, claiming their actions were in defense of public safety. That's when I stopped laughing. Kara called 5 minutes later. They're trying to flip the narrative. No kidding. They're accusing you of maintaining an unsafe structure, citing community safety exceptions under county nuisance statutes. My barn had a safety inspection 8 months ago, which you have a report for. In my office drawer. Get it. We need an expert witness, and we're going to file a preemptive civil action. Within 2 days, Kara brought in Arnold Dixon, a retired structural engineer who'd done the original inspection when I insured the barn. We filmed him standing in front of the ruins, holding his clipboard like a courtroom exhibit. This structure, he said on camera, was sound. Reinforced beams, new trusses, weatherproofed. There was no danger to anyone. If anything, it was safer than most of those prefab homes in Aspen Hollow. Meanwhile, HOA doubled down. Karen had obviously spun the narrative hard inside their bubble. They published a community letter claiming I'd ignored repeated safety warnings, refused to engage in productive dialogue, and had a history of hostility toward cooperative development. A guy named Randy, someone I'd never met, posted a long Facebook rant calling me a toxic loner with a paranoid fixation on old buildings. Another HOA board member, Susan Maxton, even implied I'd threaten neighbors with violence. It was so brazen, it almost made me admire their nerve. Almost. I took a different route. I dug up the insurance documents, the historic registry paperwork, even the purchase records for the commercial equipment stored inside. Kara filed an affidavit itemizing everything destroyed: the tools, machinery, documentation archives. We calculated the value, backed it with receipts, and filed it as part of the damages claim. We also contacted the Colorado Historical Property Office. A representative confirmed the barn had been listed as a contributing structure to a registered legacy farmstead. Karen's demolition wasn't just criminal, it violated state historic preservation laws. Then Kara made her move. She contacted Senator Troy Carlson, a Garfield County native and longtime friend of my family. Troy had helped push through rural property protections a few years back. When he heard what had happened, he didn't mince words. That woman bulldozed a historic barn, and she's trying to justify it by calling you a safety risk. He sent a formal request to the county council to audit every HOA enforcement action filed in the past 2 years. Said it was time to see just how far Aspen Hollow had been operating outside the law. Karen's smear campaign didn't stop, but the tone shifted. A few neighbors from outside Aspen Hollow reached out. One woman from the next valley emailed me saying her father's tools were once stored in that barn. Another sent photos from a wedding reception we'd hosted there years back. The press was split. Some swallowed the HOA's safety story. Others started sniffing around the forged permits and criminal charges. One headline hit local radio: Historic Barn or HOA Scapegoat. Farmer Strikes Back. I kept working through it all, hauling what I could from the wreckage, feeding Samson his pain meds, reinforcing the fence line. Every time I found another shattered board, I thought about the HOA calling me dangerous. But the more they tried to paint me as the villain, the more obvious it became. They weren't defending a neighborhood. They were defending their mistake. And it was catching up to them. The subpoena hit the HOA offices on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, the gloves were off. Senator Carlson's formal audit request had passed through the County Ethics Board with surprising speed. Evidently, ours wasn't the only HOA in Garfield County flexing a little too hard, but Aspen Hollow had the misfortune of attracting statewide attention because of one demolished barn and one very public investigation into forged permits. Karen and I sat in the courthouse watching the first round of document reviews. The HOA's lawyer, now visibly more nervous than slick, tried to stonewall. We believe these records are internal and protected by association confidentiality. The judge wasn't impressed. Not when they involve suspected criminal acts or forged government documents. Produce the records. They did. And what came out was worse than we'd imagined. For starters, not one of the HOA's interventions over the past 2 years had followed proper procedural steps. Several properties adjacent to Aspen Hollow had been pressured to voluntarily conform to HOA standards despite never opting in. At least 2 elderly homeowners had paid thousands to repaint or re-landscape, believing they were legally obligated. One man had sold his inherited parcel after repeated violation letters and threats of liens, all outside the HOA's legal purview. Karen's name was on nearly every one of those actions. Then came the smoking gun. Buried in the file for my own case was an email chain between Karen and a local construction company. She'd written, "No need for permits. It's outside county enforcement range. Just make sure it's down by Thursday. Owner won't be there. I'll reimburse through HOA discretionary fund." That discretionary fund turned out to be a mismanaged slush pile Karen had full control over, supposedly earmarked for landscaping emergency reserves. I didn't say a word as Kara read the chain. Aloud in court. I didn't need to. The room was dead silent, but the next witness broke that silence wide open. It was Ron, the same dozer operator who'd given us the initial statement. This time, he wasn't anonymous. He sat in the courtroom, eyes low, voice steady, and testified under oath that Karen had personally stood on my land, pointed at the barn, and said, "Get rid of it. It's in the way of progress." She said if anyone asked, we were fixing a code violation, Ron added. Told me the guy was some holdout squatter messing up the community's look. The judge excused him after that. I nodded in Ron's direction as he left. He didn't look back, but I saw the weight lift off his shoulders as he walked out. The prosecutor for the county DA's office stood next. "Your Honor," he said, "we now have grounds to file formal charges of document forgery, criminal trespass, destruction of protected property, and misappropriation of HOA funds. We also intend to pursue personal charges against Ms. Karen Spencer as the orchestrator of these actions." Karen wasn't in court that day. Her lawyer claimed she was traveling for personal health reasons, but everyone in the room knew she was hiding. Back home, I sat on the porch and stared at the ridge where the barn used to cast its shadow in the late afternoon. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, no return address. It read, "I used to walk past your barn with my kids. They loved the sound of the old wind vane and the horses in the field. I'm sorry we let her run this place." Inside the envelope was a photograph, my barn glowing in morning light, taken from the hill above. I pinned it to the wall inside my workshop. That night, I added new motion lights, reinforced the gate, and set out 2 fresh trail cameras. I wasn't afraid. I just knew what people backed into a corner could try. HOA wasn't just in trouble now. They were bleeding, and Karen was circling the drain. The arrest warrant was signed on a Friday morning. Karen Spencer, president of Aspen Hollow Estates HOA, was officially wanted for multiple felonies, including criminal conspiracy, document forgery, destruction of protected property, and misuse of association funds. But she didn't go quietly. She didn't go at all, actually. The sheriff's department attempted to serve the warrant at her house in Aspen Hollow, a beige monstrosity that looked like it had been designed by a committee afraid of color. But Karen was gone. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Her phone went straight to voicemail. According to her husband, a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, she'd left for a wellness retreat in Sedona, Arizona. Kara rolled her eyes so hard I thought she'd sprained something. Wellness retreat, she muttered. Translation, hiding in a spa while your HOA burns. Which, to be fair, it was. The interim HOA board, hastily assembled once the audit results went public, was in full panic mode. 3 members resigned. The HOA's lawyer dropped them as clients, citing ethical conflicts. Residents started holding impromptu street meetings, demanding to know where their dues had gone, why their signatures were on documents they'd never seen, and who had authorized a bulldozer to take down a barn without a vote. Meanwhile, subpoenas were flying. The county's attorney general got involved after someone uncovered that HOA funds had also been used to pay for community beautification consultations that turned out to be invoices from Karen's cousin's landscaping business, a company that didn't actually exist outside QuickBooks. Aspen Hollow was imploding, and still Karen remained missing. Until Monday, she showed up in court flanked by 2 lawyers and wearing a neck brace. A car accident, her team claimed. She's under severe stress and unable to withstand the pressure of public scrutiny. The judge was unmoved. Mrs. Spencer, he said, you've been accused of orchestrating a criminal campaign of property destruction, fraud, and abuse of power. Neck brace or no, you'll respond to the charges. Karen didn't speak. Her lips were pressed so tightly together I thought they might fuse, but her eyes flicked to me once, and that flicker said everything. She thought she could beat this. The courtroom was packed. Local reporters took notes like it was the OJ trial. Residents from Aspen Hollow filled the back row, some whispering, some staring forward like zombies who'd just realized the HOA was their cult. A few nodded when I walked past. One woman mouthed, "Thank you." The judge reviewed the evidence out loud. Forged emails, fake permits, witness statements, financial records. Kara stood like a blade in a suit. Clear, sharp, cutting down every attempt by Karen's defense to blame overzealous volunteers or administrative errors. When the construction worker took the stand again and reaffirmed under oath that Karen had given the order personally, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the bailiff breathe. But it was the video that broke whatever defense Karen had left. Security footage from my own cameras, crystal clear, showed her walking the bulldozer crew onto my land. She gestured to the barn, gave a thumbs up, and walked away while the machines rolled in. No audio needed. The judge looked down at her, then back at the screen, then said, "We'll be proceeding to criminal trial. In the meantime, bail is set at $150,000. Karen's lawyer tried to protest. "Your Honor, she's a pillar of the community." "She bulldozed a historic structure," the judge interrupted. "We'll see how well she supports her community from jail." She didn't make eye contact with me on the way out, but I stood, watched her go, and didn't blink. After court, people started coming up to me, neighbors from as far as 3 towns over, a man who owned a tree farm, a woman who ran a local shelter, even a kid I didn't know who asked if he could help rebuild the barn. "Not yet," I told him, "but soon." The courtroom was packed for the criminal trial, not just with reporters and HOA members, but locals from all over the county. Red Ridge Farm had become a symbol, not of resistance exactly, but of the line that shouldn't be crossed. And Karen, she'd become the cautionary tale of what happens when power meets ego. Kara and I sat side by side at the plaintiff's table. She was calm, precise, dressed like the war was already won. I wasn't so composed. My boots tapped against the floor, steady and slow, like a fuse counting down. The prosecution opened strong. They laid out the timeline with surgical clarity. How the HOA targeted my property, how Karen used fabricated permits, misappropriated funds, and orchestrated the illegal demolition with deliberate intent. They showed the surveillance footage. Again, this time frame by frame. Karen's defense didn't even try to deny it happened. They just tried to make it sound noble. She acted under the belief that she was protecting the community, her lead attorney said. This was about aesthetics and safety. She saw a neglected structure and feared it could harm local property values. Or worse. Kara stood next, her heels clicking like gunshots. What Mrs. Spencer did was not a misguided act of neighborly concern. It was calculated, it was invasive, and it was criminal. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. Then the witnesses came. First, the construction worker, steady as ever, reaffirming that Karen gave the order herself. No permit, no oversight, just ego and instructions. Then came the sheriff's deputy, testifying about the damage, the injuries to my horse, the wrecked tools, the cost to repair. But it was the vet who crushed them. She took the stand with photographs of Samson's injuries, X-rays of the shattered cannon bone, and a quiet fury in her voice that no defense could explain away. "This horse will never run again," she said. "He'll live." But not without pain. Karen's lawyers tried redirect. "Wouldn't you agree that it's unclear who—" "I know exactly who caused this." The vet snapped. "The person who brought heavy machinery onto land that wasn't theirs." I sat still through it all, not because I wasn't angry, but because I'd learned in 20 years of combat zones that fury doesn't win wars. Evidence does. The final nail came when Kara submitted the financial reports. Line by line, she showed where HOA funds had been siphoned off into beautification expenses, emergency resolutions, and external compliance resources, all traced back to Karen's control. She highlighted payouts to ghost companies, including the infamous Cousins landscaping firm. Every dollar misused was a felony on paper. Karen sat frozen, lips pursed, shoulders stiff. Her neck brace was gone. So was the illusion. By the end of the day, the prosecution rested. The judge dismissed the jury for deliberation, but we didn't have to wait long. 3 hours later, the verdict was in. Guilty. Guilty on criminal conspiracy. Guilty on destruction of protected property. Guilty on document forgery. Guilty on animal cruelty. And guilty on misuse of organizational funds. The courtroom held its breath as the sentence was read. 9 years in state prison. Restitution of $750,000 to the plaintiff. Permanent bar from serving on any community board or HOA in the state of Colorado. All assets derived from fraudulent activity to be seized and liquidated. Karen didn't flinch. Not once. Just stared ahead like the walls had already closed around her. The judge turned to her. "You treated someone's legacy like clutter. You turned authority into a weapon. And now you'll pay for that." Bailiffs escorted her from the room. No applause, no celebration, just a long, quiet exhale from the people who watched her fall. Outside the courthouse, a local news crew asked how I felt. I didn't give them a speech. I just looked into the camera and said, "Next time someone tells you it's just a barn, remind them what it stood for." The first check came 2 weeks after the sentencing. It wasn't from Karen, of course. Her accounts had been frozen, and most of her assets were tied up in HOA funds or buried under legal appeals. But the court-mandated restitution fund kicked in, and with it came the beginning of compensation. $75,000 for damages to equipment, property, and initial vet bills. More would come later, they said. Enough to rebuild what had been lost, structurally anyway. Samson had improved. He limped, sure, and would for the rest of his life. But he grazed again without flinching, and he'd even started kicking the barn wall when I was late with oats. That was a good sign. The rest of Aspen Hollow wasn't doing as well. With Karen in prison, the entire HOA came under formal state review. The judge's ruling had declared it structurally compromised through persistent abuse of power. The remaining board members resigned en masse within a week. Some fled town. Others stuck around claiming ignorance, which may have worked if they hadn't signed half the fake orders. Then the real bomb dropped. HOA Aspen Hollow Estates was officially dissolved. Every rule, regulation, architectural demand, all voided. The state voided their nonprofit status, citing systemic overreach, fiscal mismanagement, and fraud. For the first time in years, the residents of Aspen Hollow were free and terrified. Without Karen's iron grip, there was no one left to control the chaos or take the blame. The landscape started changing fast. Residents removed those ridiculous faux Tuscan gates. Several tore down the pointless privacy screens that had blocked mountain views in the name of uniformity. One even repainted their house bright teal. HOA bylaws had banned unnatural colors. People smiled more, nodded when they passed. A few even apologized. I wasn't in the business of holding grudges against everyone. Karen had led the charge, sure, but the rest had followed. Still, some neighbors brought fresh-baked bread, or asked about Samson, or offered help clearing the rubble. I accepted with polite nods. Trust takes time. The property itself began to breathe again. Without the looming threat of inspection, without the boundary harassment, I got to work. Insurance combined with restitution gave me enough to start the new barn, but I didn't just rebuild what was lost. I redesigned it from the ground up. Steel frame, fireproof panels, reinforced walls, solar panels across the roof. I added an interior workshop with heated floors, a loft office space with a view of the ridge, and even a space for Samson to sleep inside during the colder months. And above the main doors, I hung the original wrought iron sign, Red Ridge. One afternoon, while welding the final frame, a teenager from down the road walked up. Same kid who'd once called me Mountain Hobo in a thread on the Aspen Hollow neighborhood app. He looked up at the barn, squinted against the light, and said, "It's kinda badass." "Not bad for visual clutter, huh?" I replied. He grinned. "Yeah, sorry about that, by the way." That was all I needed. As the barn took shape, I added new fencing around the perimeter, this time with metal posts set in concrete, wide-set cameras with night vision, and a series of clearly visible signs. Private property, no trespassing, HOA not welcome. Word spread. People came by to take photos. A few articles labeled Red Ridge Farm a landmark of rural resistance. I didn't need the title, I just wanted the piece. Then a letter arrived. This one wasn't from a lawyer, a reporter, or some HOA stooge. It was from a woman in another county. She said her parents had lost their home to a similar overreach, that their HOA had fined them into foreclosure. She'd followed my case, said it gave her hope. Inside the envelope was a check for $200. For nails. It said, "And justice." I didn't cash it. I framed it. The barn was almost done now. All that was left was to hang one more piece of metal above the door. The hinge. The one I'd pulled from the ruins. A scar. A reminder, a warning. The grand reopening of Red Ridge Farm wasn't a party. It wasn't advertised, catered, or covered by the press. It was just a Sunday afternoon, cool breeze coming off the ridge, a handful of neighbors standing quietly in the gravel as I swung open the new barn doors. Samson stood inside, wearing a fresh bridle and a new padded leg brace. He still limped, but he moved like he had a purpose, like he knew what today meant. A few folks clapped, a couple raised mugs of cider, no speeches, just nods. Respect. Inside, the barn smelled of cedar and iron, freshly finished wood, solar-powered lights, clean shelving lined with my grandfather's tools, restored and polished. The loft office held framed deeds, photographs of the old barn in better days, and one prominent charred piece of metal, the twisted hinge, mounted in a shadow box under glass. Below it, a plaque read, "They tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds." Later that evening, I stood at the edge of the property, sipping coffee as the sunset lit up the ridgeline in gold. The new signs along the fence caught the light, the boldest one posted dead center by the road. Private land, established 1896, not for sale, ever. The phone buzzed in my pocket. "Kara, you see this?" she said. She sent over a news link. Apparently, a new legislative proposal was gaining steam, inspired by our case. A bill aimed at curbing HOA overreach, increasing transparency, and restoring private property protections in Colorado. They were calling it Red Ridge Reform. I chuckled. "Bit dramatic." "You earned it," she paused. "You know, we've been contacted by 3 other families in similar fights. If you're interested in helping..." "I'll think about it." I wasn't ready to become a crusader, but I wasn't just a barn owner anymore either. The next morning, I walked the perimeter, checked each post, each camera. The land was quiet again, but this time, not in a fragile, hold-your-breath kind of way. It was solid, rooted. Karen's sentence had stuck. No appeals. No parole for at least 6 years. Aspen Hollow was rebuilding, this time from the inside, without boards or false authority. Some residents moved. Others stayed and planted flowers where the HOA office used to be. As for me, I kept working. Rebuilding fences, fixing machines, answering the occasional letter from someone fighting their own battle with a clipboard dictator. I didn't always reply with legal advice. Sometimes I just wrote, "Know your rights, guard your land, and keep a damn camera on the fence line."